All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first day of South Dakota Virtual Spring HIT Forum. My name is Brenda Soper and I'm the moderator for our educational series today. And I would like to thank Sadaho for co-sponsoring our speakers for today. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel. At the end of the presentation, we will go through all of the questions. We are placing all attendees on mute to limit any distractions or background noises at this time. Today, our first presenter is Dr. Daniel Nygren. He is presenting on When Hacktivists Target Your Hospital. Dr. Nygren is the Chief Information Officer for Maine Health. He previously served as a Senior VP and CIO at Boston Children's Hospital, as well as Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. As CIO, he has been responsible for all IT systems at both of these large multi-billion-dollar organizations. As a practicing physician, medical informatics researcher, and IT executive, he is in a unique position to put into practice cutting-edge technologies and ideas, bringing advances to patient care, quality, and research, but also keeping in mind the needs of busy clinicians. Welcome, Dr. Nygren.
Thank you, Brenda, for that great intro, and appreciate the opportunity to join all of you and share this story with you. I don't have any financial disclosures to make, so we can continue on to the next slide. What I'm going to talk about today is a really harrowing sequence of events that occurred to us at Boston Children's Hospital when I was still at that organization back several years ago, almost 7 years ago now. And what I love doing is essentially walking folks through exactly what we experienced, because this was such an eye-opening series of events for us that it really underscored the importance of paying attention to cybersecurity and a whole slew of other things with regard to our hospital. And I feel like the best way to convey that sense of urgency and the seriousness of this stuff is to walk through the actual events with you and let you live it along with us as we did. So we're going to talk about what happened, basically. We'll then review how we responded to each of the events as they arose. Importantly, we'll talk a little bit about what we learned, the lessons that we took away from this event. Then a little bit about, could this happen again? Obviously, I think you all know the answer to that one. It's yes. And then a series of postscripts that you really have to hear to believe, just an unbelievable sequence of events. I won't spoil the surprises. Okay, next slide, please. So this all started with what I like to refer to as a shot across our bow. It was in mid-March. We were notified by a cyber intelligence group that we had no formal relationship with. We had been talking a little bit to them about potentially doing some consulting work for us, but basically they just called us up one day and said, hey, FYI, we're seeing a bunch of chatter on Twitter and this website called Pastebin, all purportedly from the hacking group called Anonymous. And they're essentially threatening to target your organization. So you might ask yourself, well, why is Anonymous a group that's sort of known the world over for attacking countries or federal agencies or big, commercial enterprises? Why would they set their sights on a hospital, let alone a children's hospital? Well, it was a result of a very highly publicized child custody case that we were in the midst of. This was a teenage girl who was being taken away from her family because of concerns about medical child abuse. I'm not going to go into any more details about the case. They're really somewhat irrelevant for the story that I'm going to tell, but suffice it to say that this was very much in the media. The child's family was very vocal, was talking to the press all the time. And obviously, because of HIPAA constraints, we were not able to do the same. And so a very one-sided view of things was being portrayed in the media. And that's what Anonymous was reading. Again, as a bit of a reminder, Anonymous refer to themselves as hacktivists. They see themselves on the right side of the law. They see themselves as trying to right wrongs wherever they occur. And they use technology and essentially cyber attacks of various different forms to achieve their means. And so Anonymous had decided that what they were reading about was disconcerting enough to them that they decided to set their sights on us. So what does that mean? Even in this initial period, they started doing what I later learned was something called doxing. And doxing is essentially posting information about individuals or organization online. And this is not particularly sensitive information. It's things like address, phone number, home phone number, office location, things like that. Essentially, ways of trying to intimidate the individuals involved in these events that these folks were watching, and that if they didn't do what Anonymous was asking them to do, that worse things would occur. Importantly, the presiding judge from the state of Massachusetts, who was involved with this case, doxes of that individual's information were also posted online. What's more, they posted details of our external website online. And when I say details in quotes, what I mean is they posted our IP address for our primary website. This is not something that's particularly sensitive. It's something that any middle school or high school student nowadays would have the resources to be able to get and figure out. So again, it was just a veiled threat, essentially. Now they did one last thing, and that's what I'd like to show you next. It's a 1-minute video that was posted on YouTube. So I'm gonna be quiet for a minute and let this go. And maybe we can't hear the audio. Unless there's a way that you guys can figure that out quickly, I can talk to it.
No, I got it, just a second.
Okay.
Greetings, fellow citizens. We are Anonymous. It has come to our attention that a 15-year-old girl has been held against her will by the state of Massachusetts for over 1 year. Boston Children's Hospital believes that it all is merely in her head, and as a result, she has been detained in addition to being tortured physically and mentally by this corrupted system for nothing more than being sick. Anonymous and the American people will not tolerate this abuse of our children and will retaliate using whatever means necessary in order to protect our fellow citizens from this abusive and manipulative behavior.
So hopefully you were able to hear that. Now, as CIO for a long time at Boston Children's, I had been called many things over the years with folks who were disgruntled about something or another, but I can't say that I'd ever been referred to, or my organization referred to, as one that tortures or all of those other things that they were talking about children. So clearly a very concerning posting, and one that we saw early on. And so to the next slide, we were nervous. We didn't know what to make of all of this stuff. Could this be the real Anonymous? it wasn't hard to get the details that they posted online. As I said, it was publicly available information. Obviously, anyone can post on YouTube. So do we just assume this is a bluff and do we just discount it? And obviously the correct answer here is no. And of course, hindsight 2020, the obvious answer was no. And in fact, we did very much the opposite. If you continue down, clicking through on this same slide, what we did is actually convene the hospital's incident response team. This is the exact same group of people who convened for a weather-related emergency. It's the exact same group that had convened just 1 year prior when the Boston Marathon bombing had occurred, obviously a critical event. And so this is obviously a group not just composed of information technology folks, all of the emergency planning people from across the organization, from clinical areas, administrative areas, they were all included in this incident response team. And we primarily were focused on whether we might have to do what we were referring to as the time as going dark, essentially cutting ourselves off from the internet in order to protect ourselves from any form of attack that might occur. We obviously sent an email out to the entire organization to make them aware of what was going on. We didn't give a lot of details. We basically sent a more strongly worded message than normally we would send out about practicing, best practices with respect to email and not disclosing anything over the telephone to people. And then we did one last thing, and that was to contact the authorities. One more click on this slide. Yeah, so we called the FBI, we called Homeland Security, the Boston Police, anyone and everyone we could think of. And they were all very polite and responsive. They said, thank you very much for letting us know. You did the right thing. But also, we can't really do anything to help you or assist you at this point. Why? Because these folks haven't done anything that breaks the law. They've posted publicly available information. They made a video on YouTube. We have free speech in this country, and so let us know if anything else happens, and keep us posted, basically. So to say that I was a little bit miffed at this would be understating. I thought they would come in with the cavalry and help us, but that was not exactly what happened. Nonetheless, we let them know, and so we turned ourselves back to making sure that we were as protected as we could be. Next slide, please. So we waited at that point, and we waited a while. We waited about 3 weeks, it turns out. And at that point, before the attack started, we actually were starting to think that this might have all been a bluff, because we were preparing, for the onslaught to occur within days. And after a week and 2 weeks and then 3 weeks went by with nothing, we were not sure that anything was coming. But in fact, it did eventually start. And how it started is with this DDoS attack, a low volume DDoS attack. Now, a DDoS attack, DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service Attack. For the non-techies in the audience, this is essentially a flooding of our internet site, of our website, if you will, with all kinds of malicious traffic. The analogy I like to make is back in the old days when Ticketmaster used to announce some big concert that was coming to town, and websites were not as set up as effectively as they are now. And you could basically slam a website because everyone was logging in at the same second to get to the website. I suppose nowadays the analogy, more current one, is when everyone's trying to get a COVID vaccine all at the same time. Nonetheless, that's essentially what a DDoS attack is. It's flooding a website with a mountain of network traffic that essentially crashes the website and paralyzes you, not only from any further inbound network traffic, but also outbound network traffic. So folks within the hospital would not be able to get out to the internet, which obviously is really important for a lot of functions. So When I say low volume, this was stuff that we were able to deal with. Our own technical folks were able to change some network settings, adjusted our firewalls and so on. And we were able to continue to operate normally. What happened next was this cat and mouse game where we would adjust things and accommodate the volume, and then they would dial up the volume or change their type of attack, and back and forth and back and forth. And this happened for about another week or so, to the point at which at the end of that week, we were really getting nervous because we were running out of ways in which we would be able to tweak things on our end to be able to continue to protect ourselves. I should set the context in terms of timing for when all of this was happening. I mentioned the Boston Marathon before. After that 1 week had elapsed, it was the actual weekend of the Boston Marathon bombing. It's also Easter. Patriots Day in New England is a holiday that everyone has off. It's a very festive time, but it was also a very harrowing time because people were worried about potential copycat episodes to follow on from the Boston Marathon. And so the city was definitely a bit on edge already. And then we had this layered on top. So that weekend was when we really got brought to our knees, essentially. They cranked up the knob on that DDoS attack all the way up. And we were at that point paralyzed. We were just not able to accommodate things anymore. And thankfully, we were able to engage a third-party cybersecurity vendor who we had been talking to in the weeks up until this point, who engaged their help in assisting us to filter the traffic. On the next slide, you can see a graphic illustration of what we went through. Let me orient you a bit to this slide. If you look at the very first little blue bump on the left over by April 11th, that was before the attack started. And that was a Friday, and that's typical Friday internet volume into our primary external website. So it's roughly about 0.6, 0.7 gigabits per second of internet traffic. The weekend is generally quieter, and so that's what you see on the 12th and the 13th, very little traffic. But then when the attack started on April 14th, you see those same little humps, those blue humps, but they're now superimposed on that new blue baseline. And that new blue baseline was the initial low volume DDoS attack. What you can see as the weekend arrived on the 19th, 20th, 21st, is they were really starting to crank things up, like I said. And the last blue peak before the red started, that was where we were paralyzed. We had no internet connectivity either direction, in or out. Thankfully, as I said, we engaged the third-party vendor. They did their job very well. And you can see all of the malicious traffic that they filtered out. So you can imagine if we were paralyzed at that first blue spike, imagine where we would have been had we not engaged that vendor, and we would have had to tolerate that second red spike. That would have really completely brought us to our knees. So, you know, we managed to weather this storm with the assistance of an outside vendor. Next slide. But what was coming was more than this. Now, what I should point out is that, as I mentioned before, we had engaged all aspects of our organization in our disaster response. And that included folks from our public affairs and marketing team. And these are folks that include social media experts who normally monitor to see what folks are saying about our organization and posting stories and so on. Well, we recalibrated those folks to instead monitor social media everywhere they could for more anonymous postings and mention of what was going on. And you can see there was no shortage of those. So this is a series of tweets, a few of which I'll comment on. The first one references the Mass Medical Society. This is the organization in our state that issues medical licenses to all the physicians. Why they decided to target the Mass Medical Society, I do not know, but they basically launched an exact same DDoS attack on them and brought their website completely down. The next one you see is Wayside Youth. That's in fact the rehab facility that the patient went to after she was at our organization, they decided that they too should be punished, and their website was down, and theirs, they were not as fortunate as us to be able to engage a third party, and they were down for weeks. But then finally, and this is the one I really wanted to focus on, was this post. And you can read it there. Doxes of your staff are next. HIPAA breach thereafter. Test us. Now, this is what we were worried about. We were worried that in addition to the DDoS attack, that they were going to potentially try and get inside of our network and get to our data. This was pre-ransomware days, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for sure, we were worried about them getting to all of our patient data to expose that, and obviously to this particular patient's data as well. So on the next slide, you can see that the attacks were not just DDoS. We started to experience direct penetration attacks on all of our exposed ports on our network firewall. Any website that we had up, obviously the main site they had been targeting all along, but we have many other websites exposed to the public. Numerous research sites, philanthropic sites, patient portals, provider portals, the list goes on and on. And so what we did to protect ourselves from these attacks is we actually shut down each and every one of those sites so that we could shut our firewall ports off and essentially make no opening available to the attackers to get in. So talk about disruptive steps. I mean, this was all disruptive enough, but now we're cutting our patients off from being able to access their portals. We were in the midst of a big walkathon drive, and all of the contributions were going in through the philanthropy site. So a big deal for us. But that wasn't it. They also decided that they were going to try and get in by email. Now, normally we routinely get tons of malware via email, but what we saw was an order of magnitude at least greater uptick in what we were seeing coming in. And so again, nervous that our filtering systems and so on would not be able to protect us from this attack, because all it takes is one individual to click that link or open an attachment, and that's the opening that these attackers need to get in. So we took again, really disruptive step and shut down our entire email system for about 24 hours so that we could scrub all of that incoming email, make sure we got every last bit of malware and got it out of people's inboxes before they could do bad things by clicking things they shouldn't. And then finally, we recontacted all of those federal authorities that we had spoken to before. And in particular, the FBI was very interested at that point. And they said, okay, now they've crossed the line, they've broken the law, and we wanna know more. And so they actually came and visited us. And maybe I'm embellishing a bit over time, but I assure you that there was 3 guys who were all in suits, and they all had sunglasses on. And it was just like out of the movies. And they came to our boardroom, and they wanted a lot of info. There was some fairly technical discussion around them getting access to our log data and so on. I should point out, though, in addition to the 3 guys in the nice suits, the stereotypical look, there was a 4th gentleman there, but he was different. He was dressed in a hoodie, and I thought, gosh, who is this? Maybe he's like an intern or something like that. Fast forward, I found out later that this was not an intern. He was a legitimate member of the FBI, and he was the smart individual who put all of the pieces together behind the Boston Marathon bombing. At that point, I was quite happy when I found that out, because I did feel as though they had sent their A-team to help us out. So as I said, it was a lot of technical discussion, some strategy around what to do, what not to do. And to that point in particular, the last thing they said is to not go to the press with this story. Do not say we're under attack, please stop. Why? Because these organizations like Anonymous, they thrive on media attention. It's exactly what they want. They want to get their word out to the public to make their point. So any bit of media that they get, it fuels the fire, and it actually makes them sort of upscale their attacks even to a greater degree. So I trusted the FBI. I know the FBI had been involved with these folks many times, and so we did not issue any press releases or anything at that point. Well, you would imagine my shock when walking into the hospital the next morning. I happened to glance at the newspaper box that was by the front entrance, and I saw this on the next slide. Front page, top of the fold, blaring out at everyone who managed to glance at the paper that morning. Well, you would say, well, how did this hit the news? It hit the news because obviously we had alerted all of our staff, as I mentioned, about when we turn the email system back on, be especially careful. I mean, folks knew that something was up. We shut off our entire website. We had no internet for a while. We shut down our email. So it was no secret to our staff. And so when you've got 15,000 people that are aware of something, it's understandable how news leaks out further, despite us not making any public statement. So the story, basically went on to describe what we were all seeing in the media. Obviously, these journalists were able to look on Twitter and see all the same posts we were. And so we, were very concerned, obviously, at this point. The FBI had told us this was gonna cause a massive uptick. And we really thought that we were going to have a tough time over the course of the next several days. But we were surprised when the following happened. On the next slide, you'll see that we noticed this new post. Now, this was not a Twitter account that had been posting at all up until this point. It was a new one. And you can read what it says there. To all of the, quote, anons attacking the Children's Hospital in the name of Anonymous, it's a hospital, stop it. So despite the fact that Anonymous is purported not to have any sort of hierarchical structure, and it's a loose affiliation of people, clearly this individual seems to be in a position of leadership. If you click one more, you'll note this, this fact. This person's got 1.24 million followers, which is not chump change, right? That's a decent following. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the accounts that we had been following up until this point had a measly 6 followers. So clearly on the anonymous hierarchy, this was an individual that was lower on that totem pole. So this was reassuring to us, maybe a little bit of self-policing going on. And so thankfully, on the next slide, we found that all of the attacks within about 12 hours of that sort of policing post, if you will, within about 12 hours, everything just basically slowed down to a trickle. The DDoS attacked all of those penetration attacks into our firewall, all of the email, all of that went back to essentially normal. So we took a deep breath, we counted many of our blessings. And then I thought about, on the next slide, this quote that my parents often told me as I was growing up: out of all bad things, good things come. And this was no exception. On the next slide, I managed to get a great paper in the New England Journal out of this whole attack. But jokes aside, obviously I say that tongue in cheek, but we were nervous about doing this step, about going public, if you will, after the fact, and writing a journal article, doing presentations like the one that I'm doing today, because we were worried. We were worried about what might happen. Could this be, poking the sleeping bear and saying, oh yeah, well, you thought that was something, wait till you see what we bring to the table next. So we were nervous initially, but after thinking about it, we realized that we had to do what we thought was in the best interests of the medical community. Because at that point, back in 2014, folks were not really talking a lot about their cyber attacks in healthcare. You would hear some stories, but it tended to be more hush-hush. People didn't want to expose their weaknesses. And so there wasn't a lot of knowledge sharing in this space. But we thought that that was wrong and that we wanted to change that. And so along those lines, this paper focuses on the lessons that we learned. So on the next slide, these are some of the things that I outlined in that piece. The first is kind of obvious. Whereas before, as CIO, I never once thought that as a hospital, I needed to worry about denial of service attacks on us. That's obviously not the case. You absolutely have to do that now. Nowadays, we're not immune from these attacks and many other types of attacks as well. The next thing was something that we were fortunate enough to have the ability to do in that 3-week period before the attack started. When we were thinking that we might lose internet access, we said, well, what functions within our organization depend on internet access? So just-in-time supply chain, for example, we absolutely do all of our ordering online. Various other things that get communicated out via the internet, payroll, innumerable numbers of things started to accrue down this list. And I'm sure it'll be the same for you and all your organizations once you stop and do the inventory. So we needed to have contingency plans for each and every one of those if we were to lose internet access. We also talked about recognizing the challenge of communicating if we were to lose internet access. Obviously, with a big organization, 15,000 people, email is the primary means by which we have to communicate to folks. And so we realized that should we lose that, we need to have a different mechanism of notifying folks. We did a lot of sneaker power, having folks in our inpatient areas, in our clinic areas, have the management team get notified, and they in turn tell all of their staff. But we also took advantage of other modalities. We had luckily just put in a secure texting platform, which was independent of our internet access. It could work on cellular service. And so we took a lot of use, we got a lot of good use from that during this crisis. But bottom line, making sure that, that you've got other modalities by which you can communicate to folks is incredibly important. I don't know about you guys, but over the course of the last decade, really, I've often had to push through security initiatives. And it was never an easy push, whether because of budget constraints, security vying with EHR upgrades or other administrative systems, all vying for the same money. So there was the financial obstacle, but there was also, that physician that says, well, gosh, doc, I really don't want to have to use a dual factor authentication to get into the system. It adds an extra 5 seconds, 10 seconds, all of those times that up. You got to just cut through all of that noise because those things are trivial in the big picture nowadays, where organizations can be brought to their knees by one of these attacks. And so you've got to get your leadership behind you and absolutely push by some of those obstacles and prioritize these things. This is a fun one, fun with quotes around it. When the FBI was visiting with us, they said, if you're going to have system-wide discussions about this event and how you're going to deal with it, right? You're bringing the management team together. Some might be remote or at different locations. You're doing a virtual conference. And back then, this was mostly by conference call and less over video. Absolutely make sure that you don't put the passcode to the conference call in the meeting invite in Outlook or whatever your calendaring system is. Why? Well, the FBI had a little fight with Anonymous a few years back, and Anonymous had already penetrated their email and messaging systems. So Anonymous was essentially reading all of their emails and looking into all of their calendars. And so Anonymous just logged into the phone calls because they had the passcode, because they were shared in the same calendar invite. How did the FBI know that Anonymous did this? They knew because about an hour after one of the FBI's internal calls that they had talking about how they were going to plan to battle back against Anonymous, the audio transcript of the whole meeting was posted to YouTube because Anonymous was just in on the call and listening in. So we were very sure to not post those passcodes in our meeting invites. We used our secure texting platform to let all the folks know what the code was. And then finally, this last one was interesting too. Obviously, again, we let everyone in our organization know, if you see something, say something. And so we were barraged with people who were getting all kinds of weird messages on their phones, in email, and most of it was just routine spam that we would normally just brush aside and chalk up to routine. But in light of the context, everyone was reporting everything. And so it was getting tough for us to understand what was a true attack on us versus what was normal baseline. So next slide. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a series of postscripts here. First of all, could this happen again? And obviously, we've all seen what's occurred in our industry in the last 6-7 years with the scourge of ransomware. And clearly, those things absolutely do take out organizations in a big, big way. So that type of thing is certainly happening. But even DDoS was something that I thought might never happen again. Sure enough, a few years later, when the Flint water crisis was occurring, for some reason, Anonymous decided that a hospital bore some blame in this, and they launched a DDoS attack against that Flint hospital at the same time. So it absolutely could and did happen again. Next slide. So for a long time, I thought the FBI was not going to catch this person or people who were behind this because we didn't hear a lot from them after the event subsided. The weeks turned into months, turned into about a year, where we would occasionally reach out to them and they were pretty tight-lipped and they said, well, no, nothing yet. Well, it turns out they did have a very good idea of who the primary individual was behind this whole episode, and they were tracking him. And that individual got wind of the fact that the FBI was tracking him and decided to make a run for it. So on the next slide, you'll see that this person with his wife decided to go down to Florida, rent or buy a boat, and they decided that they were going to try and go to Cuba to get away from the FBI that was tracking them. Wouldn't you know it, this was, I don't know whether the boat had trouble or whether this person was not a particularly good sailor or whatnot. But all I know is that they ended up having to issue an SOS, essentially, off the coast of Florida. The closest vessel to them that heard the distress call was a Disney cruise ship. So a Disney cruise ship is who picked these people up off of their boat. I guess when a Disney cruise ship picks people up off the ocean, they call up the homeland and say to the authorities and say, hey, we just picked these people up. What do we do with them? And so they must have said, well, who are they? And they gave them their names. And the FBI said, oh yeah, we're looking for that guy. So essentially, by the time the boat docked back in Miami, the FBI was waiting there on the coast to arrest him as the boat docked. So he was put in prison, held in prison, awaiting his trial. Next slide. During his time while he was being held, this person was not going down quietly. As you can see, he went on a hunger strike for a while. He was very vocal. He felt as though he had done nothing wrong, that he was defending this family, this child. Next slide, you'll see that he even did interviews with Rolling Stone. It was just beyond belief. next slide, he even ran for public office, which I didn't realize you could do while you were being held on major charges, but apparently you can. Thankfully, he didn't get enough signatures to make his way onto the ballot. Long story short, this went on for years. He actually did not have his trial for several years after he was initially held. And this is because he kept firing lawyers along the way. He was just dissatisfied with each and every one that he was assigned. Eventually, he found one that met his needs, and the case went to trial. In the next slide, you can see the outcome, which I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in as a person that sat on the stand and testified to my experience. And in fact, he was found guilty. A few weeks later, on the next slide, he was sentenced and he received 10 years in jail. So not a small amount, in addition to $500,000 in restitution for all of the financial losses that the hospital sustained as part of this. So a really crazy story. It had so many twists and turns while we were in the midst of it. And that fear of not knowing what was happening next was really just a very strenuous period of time, not just for the IT folks, but for everyone in the hospital. And that was the point that I made when I gave my victim impact statement just before his sentencing. The hospital had really never been through anything like this before, and it had a profound impact on us. So on the next, and I believe last slide, all of this just underscored that we absolutely have to, as an industry, pay much more attention to cybersecurity and protecting ourselves from these kinds of attacks. As I mentioned before, clearly this was just the beginning. We've seen the ransomware attacks come fast and furious and so disruptive and cost organizations so much money, not to mention impede the ability for them to care for their patients. So it's a place we've been behind within healthcare. I think that's changed, again, probably because of all of these incidents that we've all gone through over the past year. But I still think there's a lot that we've got to continue to improve upon. And the fight continues because these bad guys, I don't know what drives them, but there's constantly new things that they're coming up with and new ways that they're trying to disrupt. And so it's not something that you can solve once and expect to be done with it. This is something that's really going to need for all of your organizations constant attention and constant focus to ensure that you keep yourselves as protected as you possibly can be. So with that, I think, yeah, that's the last slide. I'm happy to take questions. I'm seeing a few come in on the chat. Brenda, maybe I'll ask, how do you want to do these? I'm not sure if they were coming in a different way or not.
I got this, Dr. Nygren.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I got the Q&A. I can moderate the questions for you while you answer, if that's okay. Oh,
great, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for presenting today. That was nothing short of a, Hollywood movie that you normally see where people just, but at the same time, it's such a harrowing experience for the people involved, like all the hospital staff, doctors, and everybody alike, as well for the patients. So, our first question to you is, have you seen evidence that more organizations are doing what you are doing, that is talking about these situations to bring them out into the light?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I actually do think that that's occurred to a much greater degree than it was back in 2014. There's now federal organizations that meet to talk about these and to exchange information. But even so, even beyond those kinds of groups, I think organizations are much more willing to to share, because they realize that there's benefit for the collective to not keep these things under wrap, that the only way that we're going to improve as an industry is to share what we've encountered and experienced. First of all, because someone listening may have advice for you if you're still in the midst of it, but also for after the fact. Again, that's the only way that as an industry we're going to be able to learn. So I think the HIMSS ISAC group that I mentioned before, that's one of the main places that there's a lot of knowledge sharing. I know that FBI in many of their regional locations are doing outreach with healthcare organizations to do training exercises and awareness and so on. So I think we're in a much better place than we were back in 2014.
So you had mentioned during the presentation that you always, or you had to push and you had to advocate for more security practices and measures in your workplace. So the number of attacks on healthcare has increased so much, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. Have you seen or have you observed any changes in the way that the administration approaches security now, or is it more of the same where you still have to advocate a lot for the security practices that you think would be beneficial?
Well, thankfully, I do think that this created the burning platform for us at Boston Children's. I can tell you that I was able to, it was like money was raining from the sky at that point. No request went unfunded. But even more important than that, I think the organization, it was the aha that many people who might have been the same ones who were complaining about the clunkiness, sometimes the additional security measures would bring to their daily work operation. I think it was the real world event that caused them to say, wow, all those things that IT had been telling us all along, they really are potential threats, and these are real, and they can have massive ramifications for the hospital. And so we got way less pushback from individuals throughout the organization, and in fact the opposite. They wanted us to be as aggressive as we could be. So absolutely, it changed the leadership of the organization, it changed the board of the organization, and it changed the individuals, in the entirety of our organization as well, because all of a sudden, like I said, the things that we had been talking about for years and years became real for them, and that helped a lot. And again, that's part of the reason why, I love telling this story. It had a good outcome in the end. We caught the bad guy, but also because I feel like we have an obligation to share this information, and you can use this story in your own organization so that you light that burning platform yourselves without having to endure the same pain we did.
So then did Boston Children's then bolster their cybersecurity team in response to this attack with regard to their trainings and tools and staff? And
yeah, absolutely, all of the above. As I mentioned, we did get funding for a lot of additional tools at that point. Obviously, I mentioned DDoS, so that was no longer an extra thing that we contracted, on an as-needed basis with that third-party vendor. We secured that protection overall for our organization. In addition, we got some additional staff approvals for our team so that we could improve our monitoring. We also were able to eventually invest in something called a SOC, Security Operations Center. Essentially, this is an ability to have 24/7 protection for your organization. So when your staff are asleep in the middle of the night, that essentially you've got a team of folks who are continuing to monitor your intrusion tools and your other technologies that you've got in place to detect any malicious behavior in your environment. So all of those things we were able to do. But like I said, it didn't end there. It didn't end in 2014 and 2015. Unfortunately, we've had to continue to invest. And now in my new organization at Maine Health, we continue to have to do the same, because cybersecurity is not a static domain. The threats are constantly changing. You've got to be very nimble, because sometimes these threats are exposed and the attacks come in very, very short order after the vulnerability is identified. And so you've got to be really nimble and always monitoring what the scenario is looking like throughout all of information technology. It's not obviously limited to healthcare.
So then, did you find any other vulnerabilities when you brought in the third party that you were surprised that existed in your environment at that time?
It wasn't really a vulnerability, but I will say that the communication aspect I had not really fully thought about as much as we probably needed to up until that time. Email is so, routine by now that you almost forget about it. But imagine not, having that tool at your disposal. Being able to communicate to your entire workforce is an awfully tricky thing to do. And I'm not going to pretend that I've got the silver bullet for how one does that. I think the approach that we took, and frankly, the one that I think is probably the best that you can do at this point, is just to use multiple modalities, to have those paper lists of people's cell phone numbers, to have a communication tree of supervisor down to staff underneath them, to think about other mechanisms like a emergency notification system, like you might have for weather, or active shooter kinds of things. We've got those platforms now deployed at many of our organizations, and those can be used for rapid communication too. I mentioned secure chat. That was another approach that we took in the midst of this crisis. So I think with all of those approaches cobbled together, you probably can reach a good percentage of the individuals in your organization, but it's not done without planning. And so I'd say that was the biggest vulnerability that I saw that we had, apart from the DDoS technical one, was this not having thought through the communication aspect as rigorously as we ultimately realized that we needed to.
So what is the most positive change within the organization that has happened as a result of this incident?
I think, as we've been discussing, I think the elevation of the risk of cybersecurity in general to healthcare, that was by far the most positive net result. Again, I think nowadays organizations need look no further than the ransomware stories that are in the news every night. Those things obviously shine a light on this as well, but that was for sure the most positive, because you can't protect yourself against something that you're not aware of. So I think having folks outside of the IT department fully recognize the risk that's involved, to have these discussions at a board level, at an audit and compliance committee of your board level, all of those things are must-dos now. And I think to the greatest degree, I do think that most organizations are there now. But again, look at what it's taken. It's taken 5, 6, 7 years worth of incidents like this one to make that point to our leadership. So thankfully, I think we're all in a better place now, but it does bear reminding, because sometimes, if a few years go by and there's no incidents and you manage with your teams to protect the organization well, sometimes you can let your guard down. So it does require frequent reminders.
Did you have a seat at the table with your board prior to this event for visibility, or did you feel segregated and they may not have been getting the complete picture?
First of all, at Boston Children's, I did feel fortunate in that I always had a seat at the board table to talk about a variety of IT issues, this one included. But to the point that I just made for the last question, I don't think that it rose to the level of importance for the board that it did after the event. It all of a sudden became a much more hot topic, and one which the board members were paying much closer attention to when I was talking about it. So I think that I had the voice, I had the seat at the table, but I think the ears were a little bit more focused to what I was saying when I was talking about it than they had been prior. So that was probably an improvement as well.
We have a comment and a question. Excellent information and presentation. I don't work directly in security anymore, so this may be a silly question. With all the cloud-based applications, what types of processes or procedures are you seeing as a routine part of contingency plans?
Well, that's certainly one approach. If I understand the intent of the question and the cloud, having some of your information, some of your systems located offsite in a cloud provider can serve as a backup, if you will, so that if your organization itself and its IT systems become compromised, that you have another copy, or some systems might not be resident at your data center, at your facility, and instead located somewhere else. But it goes both ways. So, you know, what if that cloud provider has the same attack or same compromise? Then you've got to think about those data assets that are there, and what risk that might put you at. The other thing that I'll comment on is with the cloud, remember that to get to your cloud-based systems or cloud-based data, you need network, you need an active connection to that location. So making sure that your technical staff are putting all of the safeguards necessary in order to be able to maintain that connectivity, even if your facility's primary network environment has an attack like the one that we have. And there's technical approaches to how to do that. But that's obviously a very important thing to ensure, to make sure that even though those assets might be safe at that remote location, you need to be able to get to them. And so making sure of that obviously is important.
It looks like we've covered all our questions. Dr. Nygren, is there anything else you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
No, I very much appreciate the privilege of presenting to everyone. As I said, it's sort of my mission to talk about this now. And so I really appreciate the opportunity and hope it was helpful for everyone. And don't hesitate to reach out to my email should you have any follow-up questions or comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Nygren. It's just a pleasure with you, having you with us, and we appreciate your time. And I particularly like the story about the Disney cruise. You're
that's
right.
usually the one that gets the most chuckles out of people.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
All right, we will go ahead and take a short break and start the next presentation in 12:05.